everyone, it's Maddie.
And V, and today we're going to be talking about what we read in spring part 2. The first book I have to talk about is Starcrossed by Josephine Angelini. I adored the first 100 pages of build-up, I loved the writing, I thought it was a really effective atmosphere, but the rest of it was horrendous. I hated the toxic relationship. There was way too much mythology and too many characters introduced later in the story, and by this point I knew I was not going to continue, so honestly I probably should have DNF'd it.
Next we read I Was Born for This by Alice Oseman, and this is a book that we read together, and we've made it a tradition to always read her books at the same time. This is her first book with two perspectives, Angel, who's a fangirl, and Jimmy, the head of a boy band who Angel is a fan of. These two characters worked really well to give you both the positive and negative side of fandom, and getting to see how it impacted both parties that are engaged in that relationship was fascinating. Alice always picks really interesting relationships to explore, and one of my favourites was the internet friends in this story, Angel and her friend Juliet, who she's meeting for the first time at the concert for the ARC. This story did take a while to get going, but as soon as the two main characters had met, from then it was a whirlwind. I think there was more going on Jimmy's half of the story, but maybe that's because he was in a boy band, and that's arguably more exciting than being a regular teenage girl. By the end of it, we thought this third book was a combination of her two books that had come before, Radio Silence and Solitaire, and kind of combined all the best bits of those books to make this one. So I'm sure if you like Alice Oseman's books, then you'll like this one just as much, but it's also the perfect book to read if you're just starting out with this author.
Next I have The Wicked Deep by Shay Anshaw. I really adored the atmosphere of this book, and that was largely why I ended up giving it 4 stars. It's split into present and also a sort of fairy tale past narrative, and I have to say that the past narratives were my favourites, even though they were few and far between. I think this book suffered from having too much summary and not enough scene, which affected the pace and made me not invest in the characters as much as I might have. Additionally, the twist was super predictable, but I think honestly how it's set up in the beginning means that you can't help but put the pieces together, but luckily the lyrical writing saved my rating.
So next we both read books in the same series. I started 3 Dark Crowns by Kendare Blake.
And I read the sequel, One Dark Throne.
So this is all about 3 sisters fighting it out for the crown, and I really like the narrative structure because you get to spend equal time with all of the sisters, and that means it's really hard to choose a favourite because you have sympathies for all of them, although I would probably say that Arsinoe came out on top for me.
Yeah, same for me. I have to say that I found One Dark Throne very disappointing. It kept the same pace, which I think we both agree is a huge downfall of this series, and I was really waiting for that big consequence that was going to set off a chain reaction for the rest of the books. I just needed some of the consequences to actually matter.
And that's what we were saying about this series in general, that some of the world building is a little bit confusing. So the sisters are triplets, and it's been a tradition of their world that they will fight to decide one of them becomes queen, but it's like one as the overall queen, because they're all queens in their own right anyway. It's just like which one comes out on top. Like I didn't understand the hierarchy of
it's
the
like
world.
sudden world goes from having like 3 distinct almost factions to then what, like one of them becomes the top and they all bond together. Like
I don't understand.
Yeah.
And so if they're triplets and they know that their world has this history, why were they allowed to socialise together for the first 10 years of their life?
Yeah,
because
their bloodlust isn't as strong.
Yeah, and it holds them back from being able to achieve what this whole story is pinned on. And so it would have been much more effective if they'd all have met on the battlefield as strangers.
For the first time,
There'd be more stakes to the story.
Yeah, definitely.
And I would love to watch their relationship start from the beginning rather than have them be siblings and just it be all off the page.
Because it's kind of awkward whenever they tell Catherine like, oh, we used to braid your hair, because it's like, well, we haven't seen that.
Yeah, exactly.
So why would we care or know that they were close? That's the craziest thing to me, that the Poisoners have had like full reign for I think it's like 4 generations or something, and yet that seems to be the lamest power of the 3.
Yeah, and they're constantly talking about how Mirabelle is the most powerful one, and she's got like generic elemental powers. So I don't really understand like how these powers were split, because they feel so disconnected, like,
and unequal.
Yeah, exactly. How is a naturalist different from an elementalist?
It only seems to be like a connection to animals. Like that's kind of it.
So
but yeah, it's not explained.
I understand the desire to step away from elemental magic, as in each sister being responsible, because that's just generic too. But they feel a bit unequal, like you said. Yeah. As I've only read the first book and B hasn't had the best things to say about the sequel, I don't know if we'll continue. The third one does have potential to kill off characters as it's progressing in the series. So if they do manage to do that, and maybe I'll read some reviews.
I'll have to wait for spoiler reviews, and if I'm excited by what people are saying is happening, then maybe I'll pick it up. But at the moment, I think we're putting this series on hold. Next, I have what I consider to be one of the most successful fantasy stories, and that is Sky in the Deep by Adrienne Young. I read this in in one sitting because I absolutely loved it. It's family driven but also a survival story, which makes the atmosphere very tense but also very emotional. The writing is so cinematic and the world building is immersive. It's slow and throughout the whole story, and you learn a lot about the culture of the sort of Vikings that these clans are. I found that the only downside to the story was that there wasn't a friendship thread. It was implied but off the page, and I feel like that would have made the story a lot stronger and more well-rounded, but I'm pretty sure there's going to be either a sequel or a companion novel, maybe told from a different character's perspective, so that's always the place to bring that up. And I also thought that the romance was, like, I could see it coming, but I was kind of disappointed that it was there because it really didn't need to be. There were romances for secondary characters, but I really didn't think our main character Elin needed one too. But it was still so good, and I can't wait to see what else this author brings out in the next few years. Next, I read Not If I See You First, which is Ali Carter's first standalone novel, and this felt the most like a thriller as her other books, while still playing to her strengths of using political themes. So this book is all about the president's son and his security's daughter, and these two have had a relationship in the past, and now they're teenagers, they've been separated for a while, and they've come back together whilst living in this little hut in Alaska, and the president's son is being hunted by Russians. Whilst that's going on, the environment is also a killer as well, and it's a survival story, so the fear factor was doubled by both of those aspects, and I really felt the characters' low points. But my one negative is that they felt completely indestructible, like they're rolling off cliff faces, they don't bleed out, they're not getting hypothermia. So whilst I'm happy that the characters make it to the end of the book, I think it was slightly unrealistic how they managed to deal with these huge traumas and come out relatively unscathed. I think I would have preferred if this had just stayed a friendship story, as I thought that the romance elements between the two main characters were a little bit forced and insta-lovey in places, so I wasn't gelling with that. But overall, I was impressed with this standalone, as normally Ali Carter would develop a plot like this over a trilogy or maybe something even longer. So if you're new to this author, then I totally recommend this one as a way to dip your toes into her writing so that then you can enjoy her series later. Next, I have The Smoke Thieves by Sally Green, which is her return to the YA scene. This is my first instance of reading a fantasy with a lot of POVs. They were each adding a very different thing to push the narrative forward, and I have to say I had a clear divide between liking half of them and disliking the others. This is set in a world where smoke is a kind of magical currency, but it's also extremely rare. It starts with a girl called Tash who is able to harvest this, and then you sort of follow the smoke, which is almost like a main character, as it travels from different hands, and other people across the different worlds learn of its properties and its power. Because I wasn't used to this many POVs, I have to say it took me a while to get used to the pacing, because although it was slow, it was quick at the same time because a lot was happening, but just over lots of different perspectives. And there's one thing I hate, and that's being pulled out of a POV too soon, when all you want to do is skim the other 5 characters just to get to that person that you like the most. As with most first books in a series, it feels more like a prologue of what's to come. It's established the characters and the situation and conflict, and it's also brought all of these pieces together, so I'm very excited for the sequel and to learn more about what's going to happen next, because I think the stakes are only going to escalate. Next, we both read The Truth About Alice by Jennifer Matthieu, and we were really excited for this one after both really loving Moxie. It's told from 4 different perspectives of high school students, telling you about their experiences with Alice, who has been cast out and slut-shamed. I think this is one of the most effective uses of multiple points of view, because each character felt complex and like I really knew them and felt sympathy for them, but also seeing them in the other characters' perspectives coloured my perception of them as well. It just felt complicated and well done, even though this book is only 300 pages, just because of how much was crammed into each perspective. So we both ended up giving this book 5 stars, and it's one that we want to add to our collection soon. And the final book I have to talk about is Starfish by Akemi Bowman, and I gave this one 5 stars as well because I thought it was the perfect contemporary. Kiko, the protagonist, is juggling so many things internally, some of them positive and some of them negative, and those negatives also have shades of seriousness, but it's balanced so well. Even though it's quite a sad story about a girl whose mum has never given her any love or approval, and she was sexually abused in the past by her uncle, which she is keeping locked inside, and she's struggling to get into art school. So although that's a lot of baggage that she's dealing with and all terrible things in her life, she has this amazing positivity and connection to art that really keeps her afloat. This story could have been taken in a much more depressing way, but I liked that Kiko was always communicating with herself about how she felt. I thought it made her character development far more prominent. The standout in this book has to be especially the relationship Kiko has with her mother, who is a horrendous human being, and it made me so angry to read. I don't think I've ever had that kind of reaction to a character. So that was frustrating, but it added to the realism of the story, and overall I think if the mother hadn't been a part of this book, I might not have given this as high a rating as I did. Overall, Starfish had absolutely everything I adore in a contemporary, and even though there were some things that didn't quite gel with me, overall I finished the book just so happy having read it, and I loved the ending and the epilogue and how everything was tied up, and just there was so much happening. I felt like I'd spent a lifetime with Kiko, not just 300 pages. And lastly, I read the first 2 books in the Skin Book trilogy, Ink and Spark by Alice Broadway. I really enjoyed Ink because I thought it was really beautifully told. It relies a lot on fairy tales as a world building technique, and that ended up being a really effective device for the second book, where Leora, the main character in the first, is with the marked community, aka they have tattoos, and in the second book she goes over to the blank community, and they tell the exact same stories but different, and so you get a great picture of the contrast between the community and how they've been taught and socialised differently. I thought that the adult characters in this book were really great, similar to the Divergent series actually, where they all have a specific purpose in teaching the main character something or showing her something about the world that she doesn't already know. But as with most dystopians, I wasn't connecting to the main character that much, and I think that's just because she is claimed to be brave and courageous, but I don't see that translating on the page, and so it feels unearned. So overall, I'd say if you like the dystopian genre, then I'd definitely recommend these books, but on the other hand, they follow the classic formula, so if you've read the Uglies series or Delirium, you'll know exactly what the second book is doing that the first book did, and you can almost predict where this series is going to go in the final book. So we've finally caught you up on all of the reading that we've done throughout the year. Thank you everyone so much for watching this video. We make writing videos every Tuesday and bookish videos every Friday and Sunday. We post regularly on Twitter and Instagram, and you can follow us at Maddie and B. We'll see you next time!